Yesterday, I and some young adults and a priest friend of mine drove up to New Clairvaux Abbey in Northern California. It's about 2 hours from here. At this abbey, that's been there for about 70 years, their church is constructed from an old chapter house from Avila, Spain. And a chapter house is a building where the monks, the Cistercians or the Trappist monks, will go and every day have a reading from the Rule of Benedict, which is their rule for their life and their obedience. The building that came over to the United States in the early 20th century, when it was built, it was 3 centuries before Christopher Columbus made his voyage to America. 6 centuries before the Declaration of Independence. And the ancient chisel marks that are in the stones that the masons put into them, they get paid for how many stones they made. They're still there, and you can put your finger in the groove of where somebody chiseled this out, whose bones have already disintegrated to dust. 835 years ago. The Lateran Basilica is twice that age. In fact, it's over twice that age. It goes back to the early church. It is the Catholic Church as it's becoming Catholic. Constantine, the first Christian emperor of the Roman emperor, did not rule the entire Roman Empire at this time. In fact, he just won over the Western Empire a year before. In AD 13, he began building this church, or actually he donated the land, and the church was building it a year before Christianity was declared not to be an illegal religion. And the pains of persecution and amputated limbs and everything else that the Christians suffered, are still visible to the people going to this church. It was consecrated in AD 324, 1 year before the Council of Nicaea, 57 years before the Nicene Creed, which we recite every Sunday, was put in its final form. In fact, all the doctrines, all the dogmas that you and I appreciate were not yet codified. There was no specific rule or understanding of Mary being the mother of God, or the perpetual virginity, or the primacy of the Pope, or papal infallibility, the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption of Mary. All these things were not written down, but the seeds were there. The Catholic Church, we never invent anything. It's always based on what is in the sources in the past. And those, over time and years, God discloses and reveals to us more and more what that means in our faith. But it's always about the sources. And those seeds of faith are present in the Lateran Basilica. There's little that remains of the Lateran Basilica that was there originally in the 4th century when it was built. Under the altar is what's left of a table that they believe that they claim St. Peter celebrated Mass on. I'm sure it's true. But what really matters, think about this for a second. If you want to find what remains from this original church, you have to go under the church, because the foundation stones which it were built in the time of Constantine remain. You have to go back to the foundation of the church. The top of the church, over many centuries, it wears down and it gets replaced. There's very little remaining except for the foundation. And that's like Paul says today, no one can lay a foundation other than the one that is there, which is Jesus Christ. So our faith must be informed always by the early church and the understanding of where we came from, and find our sense of bearing, our foundation, our roots in the seeds of the church. Kierkegaard put it this way. He said, we can only go forward if we look backward. We constantly need to look backward to find out where our sources and what they tell us. Somebody asked me for an example. Would somebody ask me for an example? I'm glad you asked. In the late 19th century, church historians were going through some ancient documents, and some of them were from the east, further east, some were from Rome, other places, and they ran across a liturgy of St. Hippolytus, who was from the 3rd century, a Roman. They looked at it and they said, here's what we are going to do. They took it and they put it in the Roman Missal that you use today. We use today. It's called Eucharistic prayer or anaphora 2. And we are going to say that. We are going to be saying part of a liturgy that is from the first years of the Basilica. In other words, we may be saying the very same Eucharistic prayer that they used. We go back to our sources. We see where we belong. It helps us connect with what's called often the democracy of the dead. Centuries and centuries and centuries, all the church, all the people of the faith have contributed to this, and we never just throw it off for something new, but we take it and we use it. It says in the book of Matthew, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." We benefit from both. How does it relate to you and me? We need to make sure that our lives are connected to our sources of faith. The things that the church teaches, we need to be able to go back to what we've been instructed and benefit from those. And in fact, if we start building on this foundation, which is Christ, and try to put something else above it that is not what God teaches, what the church teaches, you know what we want God to do? Well, let's put it this way. When I was a kid, I used to like to make houses with playing cards. Did you ever do that? Houses of cards? And one time I made this really beautiful one. It was like 2 or 3 levels. I'll say it was 3 levels. I think it was 2, but we'll say 3. And I made it on my grandfather's table. He was in his 90s, about his 90s at that time. I was really excited, and I showed it to him and everything, and he was sitting there looking at it. And I went and got my parents to show them the card house I had made. And when I came in, he kind of had this sheepish look on his face because he touched it, and it fell apart. That's what we ask God to do when we are building wrongly on this foundation, which should be Christ. We are called always to ask God to break down what is not of Him and raise it again on the foundations, which is the Lord.